It's the 1st of October and you're watching CNBC Africa's special broadcast of Nigeria's 59th Independence Day. A very warm welcome. I'm Kenneth Igbomor. And as we forge ahead as Africa's largest economy, 59 years has been quite a journey. Since the breakaway from colonial rule, Nigeria is currently in its fourth republic and democracy has taken a much stronger hold since 1999. To discuss how Nigeria plans to forge ahead, my guests for today are Chamberlain Peterside, is the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisory. Also, Nevin is a partner and Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria. And Ajuri Ngelale is the Senior Special Assistant to President Muhammadu Buhari on Public Affairs. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen, for today's show. All right, then. Interesting 59 years. I'd just first like to get your reflections on Nigeria at 59. Let me start with Chamberlain.
At 59, Nigeria is a grown man, trending beyond middle age. And I think there's been quite a few lessons learned. We've fought civil war, come out of it. We're in the fourth round of our democratic practice. And it's been quite a bit of a challenge. We've stumbled, but we're still standing, and I think that's a reason to celebrate.
Andrew, from where you sit?
Well, I've only been here almost 11 years, not the whole time, but I'm feeling more optimistic than I have in the entire time I've been there. I mean, we're all aware of the challenges in Nigeria, but there's so many positives we can talk about through the course of the show, and I think the next few years are going to be really good for Nigeria.
Ajuri?
Well, I think generally our people reflect on Nigeria up until this point in the context of, say, maybe missed opportunities, maybe feeling like we should be further ahead than where we are. But that notwithstanding, I think when you look at the challenges and the complexity of the country in terms of our diversity, we would acknowledge that after everything we've been through, it is something of an achievement that we are together, that we are unified. And I would say that even in terms of development, we are now beginning to expedite the kind of process that we have long hoped for in recent years. So I think there's absolutely reason to be optimistic as we turn 59.
All right, but when you look at the general national dialogue for Nigeria, for you, what sticks out for you as a sore thumb? Let me start again from Chamberlain.
I think what sticks out is on one hand, the diversity, and secondly, staying together. Just like Ajuri said, it's one thing to be so diverse and stick together despite our differences. We had been able to keep moving despite our differences in ethnicity, in languages and the rest of it. But most importantly, in the face of some of the economic challenges we've had recently, staying together, addressing the youth unemployment, insecurity, and things like that, despite all the challenges, staying along, I think is something to really be quite optimistic about.
Andrew?
No, I agree with Chamberlain. I think what's changed, and let me stick to economic matters for the country, but I think what's really changed for me in the last few years is the nature of the dialogue. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I think people still had this view of oil as a national cake. How do we divide up the national cake? And I think even though we have a lot of way to go, the whole dialogue has changed. People have a discussion about youth unemployment. We have a discussion about poverty. We have a discussion about the problems of the energy industry. We have a discussion about the fuel subsidy. We have a discussion about the CBN Forex rate. We discuss ease of doing business. And that's completely different than 4 years ago, where these issues were not on the agenda. So some people might say, it's hard to point to tangible progress, but I think it's huge. The nature of the debate has changed, and there's nowhere to hide. If you're not addressing the poverty issue, if you're not addressing the power issue, if you're not addressing the youth unemployment issue, you're not part of the conversation anymore in economic matters for Nigeria.
Ajuri, what sticks out for you?
Well, I would look at the bedrock of what Andrew just mentioned, which is ultimately that because we are now in the longest consistent thread of democratic dispensation that we've had in our history, it has evolved to the point where we can have these open conversations without the threat of reprisal, without some of the other issues that have come up in the past. And I think that allows us to focus on the kind of bread and butter development issues as it relates to the economy, as it relates to our political synergy, as much as possible. And I think ultimately, because that is there, now Nigerians are able to ask the hard questions about what government is doing about their welfare, whether it's the education sector, whether it's power, whether it's diversifying into agriculture, whether it's the development of social investment programs, amongst many other things that are going on currently. So ultimately, I think we should appreciate the fact that this 20-year run that is ongoing in our democracy has enabled those conversations to take place.
Yeah, a very interesting 20-year run, as he rightly mentioned. Yeah. But then I'd like to get to the core of this, because we've listened to quite a number of people speak, from Bill Gates to a number of global organizations, talking about the fact that, the key resource for Nigeria is its people, and how is Nigeria investing in its people? I would like to get your perspective on how, first, Nigeria has gone about it and how we're looking to get in there. The president is saying he's trying to lift 100 million people out of poverty, and I would like to get your sense, first from your areas, as an economist, Andrew, and let me start with you, Chamberlain.
I think that we could have done better in terms of investing in our youth. We are trending at a point where Nigeria is being called the poverty capital of the world. We have the most amount of kids out of school anywhere in the world, and those numbers are just not good for us. But we dissipate some of our energies in other things. The government is very expensive, so when you take out the cost of running your government, then you have less to invest in the youth. We've talked a lot about youth unemployment and then the crime that emanates from there. The reason is simple. It's education, lack of the right kind of education. Our educational system that we inherited from the British had been such that you get a degree, paper, certificate without skill set. So again, it takes us back to, where do you focus your attention? In the right kind of education, the right kind of training for the youths. And this myth about the youths being lazy is just not right, because if you give them the correct environment to grow, I think they would foster. And that's, I think, where the effort should be. The government should prioritize whatever is very key to its future. The bulk of our population are the youths. 65% or thereabout are below the age of 35 years. So the future belongs to the youths, whereas the effort and the emphasis we're making in our investment programs is not commensurate to their advancement. And I think that's where we should change priorities.
Andrew, as an economist, looking at that demographic dividend, the youth, how we are strategizing for the future. We've heard the numbers, by 2050, how much either we're going to have a boom or we're going to have a problem on our hands. But looking at how we should strategize economically for the youth, I'd like to get your input on this.
Well, I think Chamberlain said it very well. We're not investing enough, right? And we've misprioritized. I mean, the resources, we all know that the government, state sector resources are very small. The resources that are there are being sent in the wrong direction. So if I understand the mathematics right, it's widely publicized. We spend more on the fuel subsidy than we spend on education. That cannot be the right set of priorities. Again, the cost of governance is very high. That can't be the right set of priorities. But within the education sector too, I think there needs to be a prioritization of technical and vocational training. Sometimes we think too much every youth needs to go to university. But if you actually look at Germany, which is arguably the world's best economy, people are very proud with their technical skills and they have good careers, they earn good money. Brazil, another developing economy, has invested a lot in the vocational and technical skills. So we need to reorient the resources we have into the youth. And I think everyone recognizes now, I mean, what we're saying here is not news, it's in the media, that it's an urgent priority. So I think the pressure is on the public sector to kind of move in that direction. The last thing I'll say on this, though, is the people demand and want it too. So in Lagos, 85% of the school children actually go to private schools. So people want education desperately for their young people, for their children, and they're actually using their private resources because the public resources are not there right now.
Ajuri?
Absolutely. Look, I think everything that's been stated here is absolutely true. I would just add to that this administration has been very committed to reversing those trends, and I'll be very specific in what I'm talking about. I think when you look at the fact that we must industrialize and we must give our children the chance to compete in the future of what is now a knowledge-based global economy, we have to essentially have what is going to be a kind of curricular revolution in the sector. What this administration has committed to is that in view of the dearth of resources over the course of the first term, us being in recession, we had to do what many nations have done in recession, which is spend heavily on infrastructure, get our people back to work, and ensure that we have people, we are creating jobs for people to rejig the economy. We are now out of recession, of course, but growth isn't as fast as we want it to be due to a multiplicity of both local and international factors. But now in this second term, what we've said is we need to focus now heavily on our human capital development, both in health and education. And to that end, we have already begun the conversations with Microsoft and Google. Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo made a visit to Silicon Valley last year where agreements were struck in that direction. What we're going to do in practical terms is every single year we are going to renovate 10,000 schools, public primary and secondary schools. Now obviously because there's a constitutional mandate that primary education is the function of state governments, the federal government has agreed to work hand in hand with state governments under the aegis of the National Economic Council to make these investments. And these renovations are not going to be paint on the walls and roofs on the ceiling. We're talking about ensuring that our curriculum is based on STEAM. That's science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. That we involve practical skill development. That's robotics, coding, animation, design thinking. That's all part of the new curriculum. We're also retraining all of our teachers in digital literacy in addition to their areas of primary kind of education as they came through their qualification process. Now, with that said, over the next 4 years, by 2023, we would have renovated 40,000 public primary and secondary schools in that initiative alone, in addition to the curricula, so that we're moving away from the theoretical, which is 40 years old and outdated, as we all agree, and moving into the practical. And the last thing I would say is in the area of job creation. We are establishing in this second term administration a $500 million innovation fund that is going to employ 500,000 Nigerian youths and orient them toward the development of, in the financial tech industry, for example, in ICT, in the creative industry, through the development of innovation hubs around the country, which we started in the first term. Under the SIP program, we established innovation hubs in all geopolitical zones. These are some of the things that we have already done, and we're going to take it to the next level over the next 4 years.
All right, then. Interesting points you mentioned there, because I was thinking about the fact that while you were talking there, I was thinking out loud in my head, you know, it's one thing to have skills for jobs of today. Yeah. It's a different thing to have skills for the jobs of tomorrow. And we understand that new types of jobs are coming up as the world is evolving. Right. You know, how much are we keeping up with the changes of the world? Chamberlain?
No, I think it's very important. Just to piggyback on what Ajuri said on STEAM education. In the next couple of years, the hydrocarbon industry as we know it would totally change. And we have always emphasized people working in the oil industry, working with the banks and all that. Fintech is also changing the dynamics in the banking industry. So do we have in our curriculum today the kind of skill set that would enable you to evolve into those new industries? My thought is I don't think so yet. But if what he said would happen and happen fast enough, then we might be able to bring the children and bring the kids up to speed. But you see, there is the diversity of knowledge at the top end and also at the middle to low level. Germany, for instance, where you have a lot of skilled, craftsmanship, very advanced, truly has scientists at the top level, but it also has skilled manpower at the mid to lower level, and people are proud of it. We lack the skill set and the craftsmen on the lower end. We import them from West African countries, as much as we also lack the high-tech knowledge. So what we have is the mid-level, where we have a whole lot of educated people with certificates in their hands, but who can't find jobs, or who find jobs and can't write and read. And we've had these stories all over. So I think the emphasis should be on the mid to lower level and at the top level, where you train scientists and people who would be able to drive us to the next level into the next century.
Andrew, do you want to comment on this?
Well, I think what Ajuri said is definitely true, that there's been a reorientation of the federal government, but I would challenge the federal government to say, look, they haven't made any hard choices here, right? So if we want to put more into education, what are we putting less into? So again, fuel subsidy is an obvious one. So where do we pay over 2/3 of our revenue we collect in interest payments because of our deficit, our high interest rates. So by the refusal to reduce, take some structural changes, I don't think we're ever going to get the resources. I mean, the other part is just the role of the private sector there. If you look at one of Nigeria's most successful companies and one of our biggest superstars, so Amal Hassan, who is the CEO of Outsource Global, based in Kaduna, 1,000 seats of educated young people in northern Nigeria, delivering outsourced high intellectual capital into the UK and the USA, that could be 50,000. So I'm not sure the federal government necessarily has to create its own programs. There are people out there that if they could support would, because she's effectively provided that education in the private sector to create those jobs for those young people. So I just challenge the federal government, to do more on the hard decisions that will give the resources to do what's required.
Ajuri, you want to make a comment?
I absolutely note Mr. Nevin's concerns. Let's be clear about something. When you talk about the fuel subsidy, which is in the range of over 500 billion every year, what you're looking at is not just the fuel subsidy in a silo. Because what happens is you remove that fuel subsidy. That cost has to be transferred, and that's transferred to the average struggling Nigerian citizen, right? So what now happens is you remove the fuel subsidy, fuel costs go up. When fuel costs go up, guess what? The cost of logistics goes up. The cost of delivering goods and services goes up. The cost of bread now goes up. The cost of eggs grows. Everything goes up. And we have to understand the complexity of some of these factors when we talk about removing the subsidy. Because, of course, this administration wants more revenues, wants more resources to be able to invest in infrastructure more than anybody else would want it for us. The key is we have to weigh all of the downstream factors when we take that kind of a decision. And I think that decision will be taken, but I think it's going to happen at a time when we have evolved to the point where our people can carry that burden. Now, with that said, he mentioned a very important point about how do you now raise revenues, because ultimately something needs to shift. That's why we have prioritized revenue generation. In 2018, for example, we generated, the FIRS, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, generated 5.3 trillion in the 2018 calendar year. That is the highest in our nation's history at a time of low oil and gas prices in the oil market, in the global markets, simply because we've been able to introduce ICT-driven innovations and ensure that more people are captured in the net. We're now covering about 20 million Nigerians. In 2015, we were only covering 13 million Nigerians, and we're going to continue to expand the taxpayer base and ensure that we raise revenues, and that's why we're having conversations right now about increasing VAT. So ultimately, yes, we need to make the hard choices, but the timing of those choices is essential in ensuring that we don't do more damage to the economy than good.
So I hear you when you say that, Ajuri, tough decisions need to be made, but more importantly is carrying Nigerians along when decisions are made, because we saw what happened with the last first subsidy crisis when the previous administration, people came out on the streets, and I could bet you 70% of the people on the street protesting didn't even understand, the dynamics of what was at play in getting that. But then it speaks a lot about communication. It's one thing if getting communication from top to bottom. Is also getting that communication as well from the bottom to the top. When you look at that feedback loop and when you look at how Nigeria is, I would like to get a sense, do you think we have progressed so far in these 59 years?
I don't truly believe so. We are in an era of social media, and we've actually seen a little bit of attack on social media. Even though we have platforms right now that can easily disseminate information, I think that government should do more in terms of leveraging the power of social media and communicate more positively than trying to see social media as a tool that would, cause, war or cause any kind of, conflagration in the country. Ultimately, I believe that there has to be a sense of inclusiveness, which most citizens over the years, if you plot the graph of the sense of trust and confidence that people have on government, you see that graph will trend lower. People believed in government much more better. There's a lack of trust on the average politician right now. And so I think when you go out in that kind of atmosphere to try to deliver a message, it's hard to be credible. It's hard for people to truly see that you're making a lot of sense. So when you talk about removing fuel subsidy, rejigging the educational system, or trying to trim your workforce, you just can't get it right unless people are carried along. So the sense of inclusiveness, I think, is on a low ebb, which presents quite a bit of challenge to the government to truly revert. So the policies could be very right. The timing could also be a factor. But unless the people are carried along, unless you devise tools and means of delivering that message in a timely manner and actually increase and hopefully grow back the confidence index of people in governance, then it's hard to get some of those policies implemented properly.
Andrew, I'd like to bring in, you're still on this topic, because our case in point, I'd like to use the recent CBN's policy directive on cashless policy. Yeah. It kind of speaks to the importance of understanding how wide the spectrum is of Nigerians who are, going to, these policies are going to affect when government rolls them out. On one hand, you have people who are well enlightened, who have been even proactive, and they're following up on what the government is doing. On the other hand, there are people who will require at least 20 explanations before they can understand what is happening there. Speaking on that communication and on understanding how wide that range is, I'd like to get a sense of, how you think we've fared as a country in Nigeria since you've been exposed to Nigeria, and now on how the government is delivering policy.
Well, I think on this dimension we're in a challenging time, because from my observation experience here, we've really in effect had two spheres that are not interacting. I mean, the government has been financed by oil money for a long period of time. And certainly when I arrived, it was booming in oil. The government had sufficient resources. So they didn't require any resources from the citizens. At the same time, they didn't deliver any services. So the citizens delivered their own security, their own education, their own health care, their own power, their own infrastructure. So those two spheres didn't coexist. They were separate. Now we've come to say that model no longer works. It no longer works because hydrocarbons are going to disappear. There's too many Nigerians, so the hydrocarbons per Nigerians decline. And we need to go to a different model where the citizens and the government at all levels, federal, state, local, are engaged together. I think the number one challenge right now for this public sector in Nigeria is to become relevant for Nigerians. So I understand absolutely the drive for increasing revenue, and I think that Mr. Fowler, chairman of FIRS, has done a great job on that, but I think it's going to be challenging to tell Nigerians to pay taxes unless the public sector becomes relevant to Nigerians. And I mentioned before, 85% of school children in Lagos go to private schools, so for those parents, even at the bottom of the pyramid, sending to private school, how are they going to feel they're paying for private school and now being asked to pay taxes?
Yeah. Ajuri, I would like you to contribute on this, Absolutely. But first looking at the fact from the feedback, the government is getting, first what avenues are available for feedback in the first place? Secondly, when the feedback gets to government, how does government communicate, its ideas more to the populace?
Let me address that last question first. We know that there's been the issue of technological disintermediation, where we go from now having a mediator between the source and the end user to now the end user being the source in many cases. Obviously, that's a global phenomenon, but in Nigeria, it's taken an interesting dimension because of the politicization of what should be core administrative issues. I think one of the challenges we have is to evolve our communications and public relations approach. From the old ways of doing things, which is essentially, under military regimes and early on in the democracy, which is to dish out information to the public and essentially say, this is what it is, take it or leave it, into now saying, we need to hear from you. We need to know that you have given us your feedback and that feedback has a direct implication on policy formulation and implementation. And I think when there's that dialogue instead of a monologue, the buy-in is there, number one, but then number two, you're finding that policy frameworks are not merely good ideas on paper, but they're actually relevant to people where they are in the peculiar circumstances in which they find themselves, which takes me to my next point, which is how does governance change the life of a Nigerian? I think over the course of the last 4 years, while it is absolutely true that historically there has been this great chasm between the two spheres, as he mentioned, we have now seen with the social investment program, for example, of 9.8 million school children are being fed Monday through Friday across 32 states of the Federation. I can assure you that you have millions of parents around the country that know that governance has touched them in a tangible way. When you have 100 billion naira sukuk bond, for example, doing 26 road projects across pretty much every state of the Federation, there's a federal road project going on. Nigerians see that construction going on. When you see railways cropping up from Lagos to Ibadan, obviously Abuja Kaduna is finished. You had the rail from Wari that was finished as well, or is still in progress, but has made quite a bit of progress. All of these things are things that Nigerians can touch and see and experience, and I think that's how governance ultimately gets to the people, and that's why you're beginning to see increased confidence on the part of citizens to pay their taxes, so that we generate revenues that can go back not into lining corrupt public officials' pockets, but into infrastructure that will ultimately attract the investment, that will create the jobs, that will further expand our revenue generation base. And ultimately, that's what Mr. President's focus is on.
All right, then I think we need to hold that thought just for a bit to take a quick break. I've been speaking to Chamberlain Peterside, he's the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisory, also Andrew Nevin, a partner and chief economist at PwC Nigeria, and Ajuri Ngelale, the senior special assistant to President Muhammadu Buhari on public affairs. Time for a quick break. We'll continue the rest of the coverage when we return. Welcome back to our special broadcast as Nigeria marks its 59th year of independence. If you're just joining us, our guests for this discussion have been Chamberlain Peterside, is the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisory. Also, Andrew Nevin is a partner and chief economist at PwC Nigeria, and Ajuri Ngelale, the senior special assistant to President Muhammadu Buhari on public affairs. Very interesting conversation we had in the first half. Very interesting input from my guests so far. But then one thing that kind of resonates from all that was said for me was the fact that was the trust issue. It was, on one hand, the government says it's doing so much. On the other hand, not too many people are aware of what is happening. And then there's a divide somewhere and people don't seem to trust the government in one way or the other. How best do you think we can address this? Let me start with you, Chamberlain.
Ken, just like you said rightly, there's definitely a trust deficit in governance today as we see it in Nigeria. Over the years, because of the inability to provide, for public good, people had truly, either knowingly or consciously, lost trust in government. Some of those who have had trust is constantly declined. And if you have such a scenario, then I wonder how you increase the tax net or arrange to get more money from the taxpayers. In my life previously, we had met that challenge of how do you generate more internal generated revenue? And the question is, I as a public servant, I ask myself, why would I have to pay more? Right now, we've decided to increase VAT to 7.5%. The question is, you're increasing VAT from the few number of taxpayers that you already have in the net, whereas you should be able to expand the net. But expanding the net is a big challenge if people don't have trust and confidence. The citizens don't have trust and confidence in governance. Business, private sector do not have trust in the policy, strategies, implementation, and the rest of it. So I think much of the effort going forward is not only in infrastructure investments, it's not only investing in people, but also it's in investing in credibility. If you bring the average person and conduct a poll in different professions and different parts of this country, I'm sure you find out that the politicians probably might be at the lowest ebb of trust and confidence of the citizenry. And that's a big challenge because it's the same politicians and the same lawmakers that craft the policies that you have to implement. So how do you implement a law? How do you implement legislations? How do you increase tax net? How do you remove subsidy when people do not have trust and confidence in your words or your actions? So that's a big challenge there, if you ask me.
Andrew?
Well, up to 65% of the Nigerian economy is informal. All right, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I mean, we want to bring those people in the informal economy to the formal economy. And I think that they voluntarily choose to stay in the informal economy because of trust issues, because of complexity issues, because of cost issues. So I think that the trust issue is going to take time. It's not an immediate thing that the government can, at all levels, can fix. But I think a very good metric of whether people are making, the government or the state sector or Nigeria is making progress on this trust issue is, are people prepared to move from the informal economy to the formal economy? So first off, what do our economic statistics mean when up to 65% of the economy is informal? I'm not sure they do. It's not a criticism of Dr. Kala. He's doing a fantastic job, but it's not easy. But we should be looking at a sign that the trust is coming as people are prepared to move from the informal economy into the formal economy. But I do think the federal government should be thinking about what will it take for people to want to come into the formal economy compared to today's situation.
On that point, let me just address, because if you look at what has been happening in the mortgage industry, they kind of worked on a little recently. They worked on how to get some of that for people in the informal economy back in the formal economy, and I think it was. So sometimes it might not be waiting for people to come in. It's more or less coming up with new initiatives, and programs that will capture them more appropriately into the formal economy.
But it needs to be. Why are people not in the formal economy? It's complex. It's expensive. They don't trust it, right? So the only way to bring them into is build trust, make it simpler, make it less costly. If we create more programs, more complexity, it's going to make it less likely people come into the formal economy.
Okay, Ajuri, on trust?
Yes, obviously that is foremost on my mind, certainly. I can assure you that one of the major components of the adjustments that are being made in the second term of this administration is to acknowledge the fact that our people have earned the right to be skeptical. They have earned the right to be suspicious. They were told by successive governments that we would be a top 20 economy by 2020. That did not happen. They were told that we would have 40,000 megawatts of electricity by 2020. That has not happened. So let's be pragmatic about what the issues are. Successive governments have failed them, and the challenge now is how do we now convince them that this is the time that they can choose to believe again. And ultimately, there's no magic wand to this. You have to earn it the hard way. You have to earn it with your actions and with the productivity across sectors that you have promised the people that you will bring into manifestation. With all of that said, the issue of how we now move people from the informal sector into an included, in a financially inclusive economic framework, I think is not just a matter of trust, even though it's an important component. There's also procedure involved. There's process involved. What are those regulatory adjustments? What are those institutional adjustments that we can make to incentivize the process of bringing in informal traders, for example, into the economy? One of the things that we've done, which has gone underreported, it will no longer be underreported, is that is a central component of our social investment program. Since we're touching, into the tens of millions now of Nigerians, we need to now, we're attaching conditions to that, to inclusion in these programs, to formal operation of BVN-linked bank accounts, for example. We are now ensuring that everything has a technological backbone. So, for example, whether it's NPower, conditional cash transfer, or the homegrown school feeding program, for example, and the vendors involved, we've said that we work through the Nigerian Interbank Settlement System, that is the custodian of the bank verification number database, the BVN, and we've ensured that every person that is a recipient in any form of this program, that they are included in the formal banking sector in a way that they were not before. If you look at what's happening even in terms of if you want to get your passport, for example, to travel, now you have to bring what? Your tax clearance certificate. Now you have to be formally registered with the Nigerian identification number. These are all measures that can be done in terms of process and procedure that can aid and abet a situation in which you can move the informal sector into the formal.
All right, then. While we're on this, I still want to stay with you, Ajuri. Looking at business in Nigeria, starting from the mom and pop shops to the big conglomerates who are doing big business in Nigeria. The Ease of Doing Business report came out saying that Nigeria is one of the top 20 reformers in there, right. More or less looking at Lagos and Kano states. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to get a sense of, the work that is being done and how much that level of work is being replicated across the country?
Very important question, and I thank you for it. First of all, let's acknowledge that while the latest ease of doing business ranking is coming out October 24th, but it has been announced that Nigeria was one of the top 20 improvers in the world, that this is actually the second time that we're being named a top 20 improver in the world. You recall after the first year of this administration, around 2016, we also made that list. I think ultimately the World Bank came to that judgment on the basis of fact, on the basis of the reforms that we have been able to bring to bear. And I want to be specific about what those are. First of all, obviously, you remember the cost of registering a business and the time it took to register a business was extensive before. In fact, there were cases of you had 6 months to even a year sometimes because of the constant human engagement between regulators and those who want to start a business. And obviously, what comes with that are the vices attached with corruption, etc. We've been able to automate those processes, and now people are able to register businesses with the Corporate Affairs Commission within 48 hours through some of these ICT innovations. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we've been able to integrate the Corporate Affairs Commission online initiatives with the Federal Inland Revenue Service. And so now by integrating those two institutions through these ICT innovations, we've also been able to streamline the process and make more efficient the process for those prospective business people. Another thing we've done is we've been able to, through the Nigerian Immigration Service, automate again the e-visa registration process. We've now brought the registration process for visa for some individuals down to 48 hours again. And look, we've taken a comprehensive approach to this. So you have the executive, which is, I've mentioned CAC, FIRS, immigration, but then you also have the legislature and the judiciary. Within the legislature in 2017, we were able to get past this administration, the Credit Reporting Act, which essentially has improved the access of various businesses to the credit information of various stakeholders in the value chains. We've also been able to pass the Collateral Registry Act, which has essentially enabled a scenario in which we're able to mobilize movable assets as collateral in terms of some of these transactions. In terms of the judiciary, we have worked effectively under the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, PEBEC, led by the Vice President, to work in synergy with state governments to make reforms. The state judiciaries in Lagos and Kano, for example, the chief judges have issued new directives and guidelines which ensure that we have brought in small claims courts the process from several months into years sometimes down to beneath 60 days now of full resolution because they've introduced pre-trial conferences, they've placed limits on adjournments. These are things that have tangible impact on people that want to do business at the local level, at the state level, and also at the federal. So I think when you look at the judicial, legislative, and executive interventions, you'll now come to appreciate why it is that this judgment was made. And the last thing I'd want to touch is that the port authorities have also enacted an e-payment system which has expedited the flow of imports and exports, and also customs through its ICT-driven system has also brought in more relevant government agencies into the process to interface online with stakeholders in the import and export business. So all of these things add up to an improving environment for those who want to start businesses in Nigeria.
All right, let me bring the guys in advisory here. I know you speak to foreign investors every now and then, and talking about the issues they have when they're coming to bring their funds, expose their businesses in Nigeria. Listen to what Ajuri is saying in there. I would like you to speak to the kind of feedback you're getting.
Quite frankly, some of what you're saying, they sound very, very interesting, but they're new to me. And realistically, if those things were truly implementable, I think that it would be a game changer. So it's no surprise that Nigeria would be one of the best improvers on that ease of doing business. But to the average foreign investor, the perception is still not what you just said. There's still that perception that it's tough to do business because it's expensive and it's time consuming. Obviously, time is money. Lagos still ranks one of the most expensive places in terms of real estate. Nigeria still ranks as one of the high cost environments to do business. So for a foreign investor, and that's why we haven't actually seen the flow of FDI as we ought to. We've seen this hot money back and forth with portfolio investments. But for FDI, you have to to put boots on the ground, you have to take hard decisions, and you have to interface with the public sector, the CAC, Corporate Affairs Commission, and a host of other regulators. As an operator, right here, and interfacing with foreign investors, the perception and sometimes the practice, the practical experience that has come out of of this reality hasn't been pretty, and that has been a historical factor. Now, going forward, are we going to see some of what you just explained coming into fruition? I believe so. If it does happen, then you could see from this point on that Nigeria might gradually begin to be an easier environment. But as it is right now, the perception is still not as easy and as free-flowing and less expensive as it ought to be compared to some of the other larger economies in the emerging market arena, China, Brazil, India, that had, even Russia, that had a very burdensome business environment. It's all eased up. And ICT, by the way, has been a key factor in that.
I see Ajuri wants to comment on this, but I just want to also say something, because last year I was at the African Investment Forum in South Africa, and in fact, you hit the nail on the head when you talked about perception, because it was one of the issues that they have been trying to work on to change the foreign investors' perception of Africa, of investing in Africa. So the African Development Bank and a couple of other development financial institutions have been trying to drive home that message that, that perception of the risk that you see in Africa is not as it is right now, because some countries are making some level of growth, and that story needs to be out there more often. Let me get Ajuri to comment, and also let me get Andrew after that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. First of all, let's appreciate the fact that we're very pragmatic about this. We're not wearing rose-colored glasses about this. We're not saying that we're going to wake up and be number one in the world in ease of doing business. We are on the top 20 improvers list, not on the top 20 of ease of doing business list. And we're coming from a very far back place. I think we were, 146th? If I'm not mistaken, out of 192. That's not good. So if you're improving at a high rate, that speaks to your progress, but it doesn't speak to anything having to do with having a perfect environment. Absolutely not. It's that incremental progress that gets you to that point. So we're acknowledging that there's progress, and what I've mentioned here in terms of the measures that have been taken are measures that have been taken. They're not in process. It's not a will be. They have been taken. It's now to widen that across all the 36 states of the Federation, and to ensure that you have the effective monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to ensure compliance in terms of the sustainability of those measures. But with that being said, he speaks to something very important, which is the fact that if you're going to attract foreign direct investment, ultimately, what are you looking at? Yes, there are the perception issues, which are very real, which can only be changed by the kinds of progress that we are now seeing. When an investor hears what the World Bank is saying and they read the World Bank report, these are the things that give them confidence that Nigeria is improving and that they can invest. So that's incremental, but there's also the structural issues, right? So if I invest in Nigeria, the cost of production is prohibitive. I'm going to have to now build maybe a power plant, or I'm going to spend so much on diesel power generation. So what is being done to address power? That's something I hope we get into in this conversation. But ultimately, unless you address the infrastructural deficits across power, across rail, across road, across ports, it's going to be difficult for that perception to fundamentally shift. Yeah. So it is a holistic effort. Perception is one, which we're working on, and then infrastructure is the other, which we're also working on, and I hope that we can get into that.
All right, Andrew, still on this topic, I'd like you to comment on this as well. And looking at how this conversation is going, I'd like you to get your view. Some would say on one hand that yes, we're improving, but that's the low hanging fruits that we're reaching at here. Those are things that we could easily just resolve now, and we're getting them done. But then the deeper seated issues, how are we going to get them solved?
Yeah, I think the numbers speak for themselves. So we had less foreign, if we're going to stick to foreign direct investment as a measure of progress on this, we had less foreign direct investment in 2018 than Ghana. How is that possible? We're the greatest economic potential story on the planet. There's negative interest rates in Europe. You're in the capital business. Capital should be gushing here. So I think the question the federal government should ask itself is, why is that not happening? I think that I've been, for years, a huge fan of PEBEC and Dr. Jamoke. I think they've done a heroic job. But again, I think that the federal government has its heart in the right place. but is not being prepared to make any structural changes. So why is it that someone who wants to invest money, it's too complex, there's too many agencies, so then we've got PEBEC trying to create the single window to help navigate that. The structural decision would be say, actually, this agency, this agency, this agency, this agency, we eliminate any necessary functions we fold into here. So again, I think the direction, the thinking is in the right place, but the hard decisions on the ease of doing business have not been taken. Similarly, what does the federal government do? What does the state level government do? We've said for some time, we're seeing lots of positive things at the state level. So Governor Obaseki at Edo State, I think the new governor of Oyo, Governor McKinley, is on the right track. Governor El Rufai, Kaduna is on the right track. Obviously Lagos and Ogun to move forward. Any governor I've left out is not, just by omission not. But so they want to do more at the state level. I just got in my inbox this morning the investment plans for a number of states, things that they want to do. So it's happening, but what can the federal government do to do less? I think the federal government needs to do less. It needs to be simpler. Let states get on with it. But it's those structural changes that we haven't seen in the first administration I'm really looking for in the second time.
Ajuri, very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I completely agree with him. Structural changes are needed, and in fact, that's why President Muhammadu Buhari has issued an instruction, actually, to legislators to look at how we can make some legislative interventions that will rationalize these government agencies. You recall many years ago, there was the Al-Ronsai report on the rationalization of government agencies, how to reduce the cost of governance, make it more efficient, more appealing to those industrial stakeholders to invest. That conversation is now being moved into the state of manifestation. And so that's important to acknowledge. And the next thing I would also mention is we're actually putting in place 109 one-stop shops in every senatorial district in this nation that is going to house the Standards Organization of Nigeria, Corporate Affairs Commission, and other relevant stakeholders to ensure that we streamline down to the localities processes, not just in terms of ease of doing business, but also in terms of business conduct, business administration, and how that can be further facilitated. So there is a lot going on, and those structural adjustments are absolutely part of the plans of this second-term administration.
All right, then looking at how the continent has been evolving, we saw the AFCFTA come on board. We've seen quite a number of traction coming in there, what it would mean for trade going forward for Nigeria. But looking at Nigeria and how we're positioning for trade, you know, I would like to tie this in with recent events that have happened in South Africa on xenophobia. And on this platform, I've spoken to quite a number of CEOs at different places. This is just beyond just South Africa alone. It's talking about the fact that some African countries are not too open to Nigerian businesses coming in there. You know, I'd like you to speak on this front. One, on what it means for Nigeria going forward.
Yeah. Just before I take on that, Ken, let me quickly touch on the discussion that we've had on structural changes. How easy it is to enable foreign direct investment to come into Nigeria. There's a strong tie between FDI into Nigeria and how we're going to play out, how we're going to play in the African continental free trade, era. Quite frankly, unless we make those improvements and they begin to manifest, it will be difficult to actually compete with a different, trade environment that we're going to see in the continent. Now, talking about not being investor-friendly to Nigeria, I think that's not totally correct. Some of the vibes we're getting is that those attacks were against, drug dealers, people, criminals, and the rest of it. I don't think the right story and the true story is out there. South Africa came out of apartheid, and they have, quite, large unemployment amongst the blacks population. And then, of course, illiteracy and inequality is quite high. So in their perception, they think that it's the Africans from other countries that are the ones that are taking their jobs, which is absolutely incorrect. But I don't think there's an direct attack on an average, well-educated investor from an African country. I spoke to a few people who were in Cape Town and Joburg during those attacks, and they said no, they didn't feel threatened. There wasn't any danger posed to them while they were there. So, I think the leaders at the very top should address, the unemployment situation in their country, there has to be more education and more enlightenment amongst the less educated people to understand the fact that the average African from Zimbabwe or Nigerian is not your enemy. It's not coming there to come and take your jobs. If you chase away all the Africans from South Africa, I don't think you're going to have all the blacks gainfully employed. It's impossible. You can't just get a job if you're not educated, if you don't have the right skill set. So, I don't see that as a threat to the African Continental Free Trade, agreement. But for us as Nigeria, I think that there's quite a bit of work for us to do to improve our competitiveness, improve the flow of foreign direct investment. Otherwise, we have some of these African countries eat our lunch in this emerging era.
All right, we have less than 3 minutes left on the show, but let me get Andrew to comment on this and then Ajuri.
Well, we've been big proponents of AFCFTA just basically because Africa can only be prosperous if Africans sell high value-added things to Africans, just at a conceptual level. But I think people need to remember this was part of the AU's 2063 plan. This is not a short-term fix to Nigeria's issues or Africa's issues. It's part of what I hope is a very positive long-term process. So let's not look for the next 1, 2, 3 years or the time left for this administration for AFCFTA. But what I will say is, for Nigeria to prosper in AFCFTA, we need to be a big manufacturer. The only way to be a big manufacturer is gas to power and manufacturing on top of the power. So if we solve the gas to power, I think we would be the powerhouse of manufacturing in all of Africa.
Ajuri?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, and I just want to add a bit more specificity to that idea. What is happening right now, and within the first 100 days of the second-term administration, President Muhammadu Buhari signed an MOU with Siemens, the global engineering giant. The details of that agreement is that in phase one, because from 2015 to 2018 we improved power generation from 5,000 megawatts to 7,000, in transmission 5,000 to 8,000, but in distribution there has been no improvement. In fact, during the rainy season it gets worse. So we're looking at less than 3,000 there. Mr. President, in his wisdom, said we must first focus on distribution so that we can feel the impact of what we're generating, transmitting. So by 2021, there's already been a forensic audit of all the distribution infrastructure in the country by Siemens engineers. 103 projects have been identified, and by 2021, distribution will rise from 3,000 megawatts to 7,000 megawatts to receive all that power. And meanwhile, we're building new power plants from the Ajaokuta, Kaduna to Kano gas pipeline, the AKK pipeline, which is nearing finalization of the contract agreement, about $2.5 billion with the Chinese group. That also includes gas-fired power plants across the north to industrialize the north as well, so that we can take advantage of the President's new special economic zones, where you have the Funtua cotton cluster in Katsina, you have the Inyimba economic city in Aba, and you have the Lekki industrial park in Lagos. All of that is essentially to ensure that we get back to manufacturing goods. We expect that through Project Mine, that's made in Nigeria for export through these special economic zones, that we are going to create 1.5 million jobs and build manufacturing percentage contribution to GDP to 20% by 2025, while raising about $30 billion annually on manufacturing. We believe we're on course, and that's absolutely where we're headed.
Well, so quite a lot to be optimistic about. As Nigeria is 59, still a lot to go, but we are still very optimistic. I've been speaking to Chamberlain Peterside, the CEO of Xcellon Capital Advisory, Andrew Nevin, the partner and Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria, and Ajuri Ngelale, the Senior Special Assistant to President Muhammadu Buhari on Public Affairs. And that's all on today's Independence Day broadcast. It's still a long journey to go to get to our desired destination, but as we forge ahead, we'll do so in unity, and faith, peace, and progress. I'm Kenneth Igbomor, and thank you for watching.